I am going to try to share my screen right now. So, that work?
Yes, we can see it.
Fantastic. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here, Scott and others. And I'm glad there are so many people willing to join into this. The main thing is that we need to have people recognizing not only that there is a legal requirement to do this, but really to have the attitude of wanting to do these accommodations so that we can truly have an inclusive environment in law school. So my name is Alison Butler. I'm the Director of Legal Services at Disability Law Colorado. I don't know most of you, although I did see that Colleen was on there. So hi, Colleen. I do some adjunct work for the trial advocacy program in January. I did not go to CU, but I am a native Coloradan. So not very many people can say that. Oh goodness, now I can't advance. Hold on. Let me see. Let me try one more thing. Otherwise, I'm going to need you to help me out, Scott.
No problem. I can show it on mine too.
Okay, so let me just try this, and if it works, we'll call it good.
Oh, make sure that the presenter view is unchecked.
Do I need to do that now? I don't even know where that is.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No worries. We're all adapting to this weird technology.
I know. And in my home, and I'm with my yellow lighting. Sorry about that. Okay, so just want to very briefly say where I come from. Disability Law Colorado is a protection and advocacy. We are part of a nationwide system of protection and advocacies that was created in law back in 1975. We were designated in 1977. Every state and territory, including the Native American territory as such, has a P&A. We were created after Geraldo Rivera did a big expose about the treatment of people with disabilities in an institution called Willowbrook in New York. And it was horrendous. And he and his whole camera crew went inside. Staff didn't seem to notice or care. There were people chained up. There were people naked. There were people, clearly not receiving medical treatment, but, and just not even receiving humane treatment whatsoever. So now every state and territory has what's called a protection and advocacy system, and we protect and promote the rights of people with disabilities, whether they're in institutions, facilities, or out in the community. So when we're looking at what does the law school need to do to abide by the laws, the first thing is, what laws are we looking at? There are three main laws, and other things come into play as well, but these are the three biggies. So first is Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, referred to as Section 504, and that applies to places that receive federal funds. CU certainly does receive federal funds, so that was really the first law that came into being that protected students and others with disabilities. But then the granddaddy of them all was the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, and that was 30 years ago this July. That was signed into law by President George W. Bush, and it has made tremendous changes in the way that things are done in regard to people with disabilities. We're definitely not at a perfect place, otherwise organizations like mine wouldn't exist, but we at least now had the ammunition to try to make sure that things get better when we find out that there are problems. The ADA was amended in 2008 to become the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act, the ADA-AA. People generally do not refer to it as such, and they still call it the ADA, but just know that it was amended, and we'll talk a little bit about why. And then in Colorado, there's a state-specific law, the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act, or CADA. Sometimes people call it the Colorado Civil Rights Act. Technically, it really is the CADA, and it incorporates almost all the provisions of the ADA and does have some broader protections in some areas. One interesting one to note is that under the CADA, service animals in training are treated the same as service animals. So the handler will have the same protections that a person with a disability who has an actual service animal would have, thanks to the CADA. The bottom line is that CU must comply with disability discrimination laws, and that applies to the students, which is what our focus is here today, but also to staff, employees, and to visitors, folks who just want to come in and see the law school. It's a public institution. People are allowed to come in, and the university is responsible for ensuring that it is accessible, not just physically accessible, although that is a big key, but also accessible in other ways. And I am, definitely willing to answer questions if people have them along the way. I know we have a Q&A at the end, but if there's something I say that was confusing, please raise your hand. And I think Scott's going to try to keep a handle on if somebody has a question. All right, so a big issue, a surprisingly big issue, is who is afforded these protections. So who is a person with a disability? There's 3 ways that you can be protected under the anti-discrimination laws. And the first is to have an actual physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So this is just this sort of basic, you have a disability. You have it right now. It's affecting you right now. The effect is pretty intense and it's of a major life activity. This is primarily the reason that the ADA came into being, because a lot of time was being spent in court cases over whether somebody had an actual disability. And it got, some things make sense to sort of litigate about, but it got pretty ridiculous. And things like if you had an amputation, but you used a prosthetic leg, then they said, well, you can walk because you use a prosthetic leg, so you don't really have a disability. So things got pretty ridiculous, and Congress said, this is not what we intended. We really intended the focus to be on, has there been discrimination? Has there been reasonable accommodations granted or not granted appropriately? Not spending the majority of the litigation on, does the person have a disability? So this is now viewed pretty broadly on whether or not a person has a disability. So the first, prong is that you have an actual physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. The second is if you have a record of such an impairment. So perhaps it's not affecting you or impacting you right now, but it is in your record. Maybe you had cancer and you successfully battled it, and you do not have any evidence of cancer right now or any impacts of the cancer right now, but because it is in your record, that is going to be considered a disability. Then the third and final way to be covered under these laws is to be regarded as having a disability, and that's an interesting one. So that means whether or not you actually have a disability, other people treat you as if you have a disability. And if that's the case, then you can be covered under the anti-discrimination provisions. The very, very important part of this is the only people that need to have accommodations be given to them because of their disability are under the first 2 prongs. So you either have one right now or you have a record of having a disability. Under those 2 circumstances, then you do need to have accommodations provided to you. You have the right to have accommodations. If you're only regarded as having a disability, then you don't need to have accommodations provided to you, but you cannot discriminate against a person in that regard. So it's an interesting one. It doesn't come up a ton, but like a common example would be is if somebody has more of a personality disorder. They get very angry, they act inappropriately, yell, and maybe a professor trying to be overly accommodating says, oh, well, clearly this person must have a disability, and then says, but I don't like people with personality disorders in my classroom, so this isn't going to work. So they've regarded them as having a disability, and then they've discriminated against them. That would be against the law. Again, doesn't happen a ton, but like I said, the big note is that you do not need to provide accommodations to somebody who's just regarded as having a disability. A big key thing is that in order to be covered under these disability provisions, a person needs to identify as having a disability. We're not making assumptions. We're not saying, oh, that person looks like they have a disability. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but we are going to be going just based on the person identifying as having a disability and asking for the accommodations. So both Scott and Matt talked about, some people it's obvious they have a disability, they use a wheelchair, but for many, many people they have invisible disabilities, or maybe it's not obvious if somebody uses a wheelchair and they ask for extra time, that you don't see the nexus, you don't see the obvious connection. So what kind of proof do you need to show that a person has a disability or needs an accommodation? First is, if it's obvious, you don't ask. So if somebody comes up in a wheelchair or comes up on crutches and says, I need to be able to use the elevator, or I may need extra time getting between places, you're not going to say, okay, I need a doctor's note, right? So if the disability is obvious, you don't ask. If the accommodation request is obviously connected to a disability, then you don't even ask about that. So if it's very clear to you just by their presentation that they have a disability and that they have a disability related need for what they're asking for, then you don't even need further documentation. However, if either one of those things is not obvious, if you wouldn't know obviously that they have a disability, like Matt talking about narcolepsy, looking at Matt, you wouldn't say obviously Matt has narcolepsy. So he would need to provide some information from a medical provider that he has narcolepsy. He may also need to provide information specifically about the accommodation that he's requesting. So, I have narcolepsy, so I need to sit in the back row. Okay, well, that doesn't necessarily, it's not obvious to somebody, so you may need to provide information on why do you, Matt, based on your narcolepsy, need to sit in the back row. I'm sorry, Matt, to be using you, but since you've been so open, I think it makes it a little bit easier. So you can ask for information to confirm the disability and to confirm the disability related need for an accommodation. Do you want to ask for a person's entire medical record, for their medical records going back to the time they were 12, from their therapist? No, you don't ask for too much information. That information all has to be kept confidential, and you only ask for the information that you need in order to determine if the person has a disability and needs this accommodation. And for professors, most of this, I believe, is going to be done through disability services, but just want you to understand what is sort of what the world looks like in this regard. So some of the basic requirements that you're always going to have to provide are physical accessibility. And I know the law school has been built since the ADA, so it is physically accessible to my understanding. But you need to make sure that if you're taking your students somewhere or asking them to go somewhere, that it is physically accessible. So ramps, widened doorways, the pull force is appropriate, the lighting. There's just lots of things that go into physical accessibility, having an accessible route around a place. There is something called the ADA, the accessibility guidelines. You don't need to read it or memorize it, but it gives information about what exactly needs to be done in a place to make it physically accessible. So the point to you is, hopefully the law school has already done that for the law school. If you're asking people to go elsewhere, then you need to be very aware of making sure that it is accessible to all the students in the classroom. I'm going to just skip to the bottom one real quick. Anti-discrimination and anti-harassment. You need to make sure that you are not encouraging, condoning, allowing any type of discrimination or harassment. And that could be very simple things like, okay, all the people with disabilities or accommodation needs, you sit over here and everybody else sits over here. And although you might not say it that way, if you say everybody who has an accommodation and uses a laptop needs to sit here, you are in essence now saying everybody who has a disability sit here. That's not appropriate. So you need to find a different way to make those things work. Or everybody who has an accommodation request stay after class, and everybody then recognizes that the people there have disabilities. So you need to make sure that you are creating, even into the very minute detail, an environment that is not having people stand out because they have disabilities. Then the middle one is the biggest one, reasonable accommodations and policies. It is a requirement. You need to make changes to even the very most well thought out policies. If somebody needs a change to something because of their disability, even if somebody's never needed that before, you need to consider that. Deaf people have different, one deaf person isn't the same as the next deaf person. They may need something different. And so it doesn't work to say, oh, well, the deaf person I had last semester, this worked for them, so we're going to use that. Nope, we don't make assumptions, and we look at each person individually. So here's just some examples. Allowing access to food and drink. Some people may need that. Some people may need to not be around that. Having quiet areas. Again, some people may need that, and you don't want to, say, nobody who uses a laptop, sit by Joe over here, right? You need to figure out a way that it's going to work in the classroom so that Joe isn't highlighted as needing an area. A service animal. Service animals are going to be required to be in these classrooms. There's very limited circumstances that they're not. Professors with service animals are also going to need to be allowed to have their animal with them. And a service animal is only a dog or a miniature horse. So it is limited. Extra time is going to be a biggie, right? Modified schedules. Matt talked a little bit about that. There may be people that cannot do early mornings, and if there's a required class that's only offered in the early mornings, then the law school is going to need to look at how they can make an accommodation to make that work. Accessible audio. So if you're playing a video for your students because it helps you in teaching, and I do love to do videos a lot of times, you need to make sure it's captioned. And that should just be something that you always do. Maybe you don't have a student in this class who needs that, but maybe you will in the next class. And it's just something that we all need to get used to, that audio and videos should have captioning, because then it just makes it more accessible, and it's something that people then start to expect. Just as Scott had said, we now expect there to be ramps. We expect there to be, push buttons to open doors. We should also expect there to be captioning on videos and widen doorways, that kind of thing. Laptops, I know some professors love everybody to do laptops. Some love nobody to do it. Some have just very, policy. But there may be people who need to do that. And so you need to make that accommodation, and you need to make it so that they're not standing out as this is the kid with a disability and that's why he gets a laptop. You need to be creative in finding ways to make them not stand out in that way. Is that it? Absolutely not. You must consider all requests, even if it doesn't seem, even when you hear it, like, how would that be related? You need to consider it. It doesn't mean you need to grant all requests, but oh goodness, sorry, I did that so I wouldn't talk too long. So you need to consider all requests, whether or not it's obvious to you that it's related to their disability. You at least need to consider it. Everyone is different and has different needs. As Matt said, not every person who has narcolepsy needs the exact same accommodations that Matt had. Not every person who has Asperger's needs the exact same accommodations. Some people who are deaf speak ASL as their primary language. Some use cued speech. Some do lip reading. Some have cochlear implants and do a combination. So just because people have the same diagnosis doesn't mean that they have the same needs. And keep in mind that a person with a disability, their needs may change over time. So it would not be appropriate to say, well, this is what your needs were when you're a 1L, so this is what you get when you're a 3L. If they say, no, my needs have changed, here's why, then you need to consider that. Offering the minimum required by law is not doing all you can do. The law school wants to be seen as a place that is open and accepting to people with disabilities. And so that requires more. That requires an air of acceptance. That requires really thinking outside the box. What else can we do? What else can we do to make you feel like you're included in the community? Not, we have a group of disabled students and they're doing great. Nope. We have a community of students who have lots of different abilities and they're doing great. And that includes thinking outside the box. And then I just really want to highlight that, offering accommodations, when you give somebody extra time or you allow somebody to take a class, you know, individually because it's only offered at 8 and they can't do it at 8, it may feel like you're giving them some special something, and actually you are giving them something special that they need because of their disability to be in the same place that other people who don't have disabilities don't need. So this is, you know, when people say we don't want to give them special rights, we actually do want to give people special rights so they can be equal. And that's what it's truly about. If you, again, a lot of this work is going to be done through disability services, but what is going to be incumbent upon you is making sure that you abide by the request, that you don't say like, oh, God, that's ridiculous. We have people who need yellow paper. When something is handed out, they need it to be on yellow paper. And time again, the professor would hand it out in white and say, oh, I forgot, you need yellow paper. You know, things like that, that's a major problem. Even if you said it nicely, like, oh, I forgot, you need yellow paper, that's still a problem. Don't forget, do it on the yellow paper, right? And don't make it difficult on that person. If you have lots of questions, then you may get to the point that you use your in-house counsel. CU does have access to that, so you can certainly do that. There's also the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, and they have fantastic information available on their website. So if you're working with a student, you're like, I don't know how we're going to make this work, that's a place that you can go to sort of brainstorm ideas. They're great. And they get paid to do this. They get paid by the government to do this, so use them. And then we're there. Disability Law Colorado, you can always call us. We cannot advise legally any professors because we would be helping the student with a disability, but we can also help in brainstorming or in doing training or something along those lines. And that's all I've got.
Thank you so much, Alison. That was great. Professor Skinner-Thompson, how about you start
now? Great. Well, thanks so much to everybody for coming today and attending this, and the concern that you have expressed through your taking time out of your schedule for our students learning. I also, of course, want to thank Scott Goodstein for his leadership and putting this together, and Scott's initiative in doing this. I think it's really fantastic, and you know, is a great outgrowth of the LILAC program that the Dean created. So I also want to thank the Dean and Dean Guzman and Dean Griffin, who also I know provided Scott some support along the way, as well as Melissa Schenter, of course, in helping organize this event. So my comments today are going to be geared more towards looking at things we can do in the classroom to make the experience as positive as possible for students with disabilities, yes, but also for all students, because I believe pretty strongly that thinking about ways to teach to students with disabilities is also just good pedagogy for students of all stripes, because we all learn in different ways. The perspectives I'm offering are, you know, informed by some research, but also just my experiences, and a lot of people here also have a wealth of experience, and so I look forward to getting feedback and ideas and innovations from each of you during the discussion period. One thing, you know, before diving into some of the nitty-gritty, some guiding principles that I think are useful when thinking about these issues is first, just to have an open mind. I mean, I think, and I'm, you know, speaking from my own experience, which is, you know, still my teaching experience, you know, I've been teaching for 6 years now. It's not nothing, but it's not a whole lot of experience. And one thing that I've already found is, like, it's very easy as a teacher, I think, to get set in patterns, right? And there are efficiencies built into doing things that you have done before, and that efficiency is good and has value and helps your comfort level. But it can also, you know, lead to habits that are limiting. And I also think, related to keeping an open mind about new techniques and new strategy, is that that can be scary, but I also think it's an opportunity to get excited and to get motivated. And in particular, I think that there can be an apprehension when talking about not just disability law, but any type of effort towards inclusiveness in the classroom, whether it be on race, sex, sexual orientation, what have you, for teachers to feel defensive. And certainly I've felt that way. Like, oh my God, what have I done in this classroom to exclude a student or to make that student experience less than optimal? And I think that defensiveness is natural. In part, it's a product of the heavily legalized approach we have to these problems, for better or worse. You know, the law sometimes operates with a heavy hand and can be scary. And I think that defensiveness, you know, is sometimes a barrier. And so I think that if you approach it, what I've tried to do, and it has taken time and I'm still imperfect at it, is when approached with requests or suggestions for how to make my pedagogy more accommodating, is to not view that as a critique of me, but an opportunity to expand my my teaching methods and improve as a teacher, and not just for that student, but for all students. And as I said, I think a lot of the suggestions that come out of disability rights movements are good, not just for students living with disability, but good for all students. Related to that is, you know, I think that one suggestion is to view students as a resource and a source of creative ideas. And oftentimes, you know, students with disabilities have been living with the disability for some time. This is not their first rodeo, so to speak, bringing their disability into the educational context. And indeed, if they had their disability in a K through 12 setting, they were protected by the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act, which requires schools to have individual education plans for students, and it's much more individualized and proactive. In the college setting, the professional school setting, IEPs don't exist, and the protections are actually less robust, but the student brings with them potentially the knowledge they have from their life of learning. Now, look, I'm not saying that, you know, students always know best. They may not, but they're certainly a source of information that should be, you know, heavily considered. Related to this, though, are two other points. One is, you know, I think Professor Doran Dorfman at Syracuse has written a paper recently, and I don't think he came up with this term, but there's this notion of the disability con, right? And this dovetails somewhat with Alison's explanation of how disability law is different than a lot of other anti-discrimination laws, because to actually be covered by the law, the person has to demonstrate that they fit the statutory definitions of disability. That's different than, say, you know, race discrimination law or sex discrimination law, which is open to everyone, okay? And you don't necessarily have to prove that you are you know, that is, people in the majority and the minority can be protected by the law. Not so with disability law. You have to meet the statutory definitions. And that means that, you know, in a lot of instances, people have to come forward, arguably, you know, and really lay out their limitations. And in some ways, that's a highly invasive inquiry. The ADA has tried to make that easier with the 2008 amendments, as Alison underscored, but I think there is still, because they still have to demonstrate that they are disabled, there's still this question of proof, right? And it leads, I think, subconsciously and implicitly endorses the idea that, oh, we need to be policing whether or not a person actually has a disability. I think that, you know, the idea that people falsely assert that they have disabilities is just not right. It isn't happening. And so, you know, when a student comes to you and says, hey, I have this thing, can you help me? They're being extremely vulnerable, okay? And they're trusting you. And I think that the initial impulse should not be to question, but to help, which I think many of us do, but I think we've been socialized in part by the law to embrace this idea of the disability con. So one caveat to this idea of, trusting students and viewing them as a source of creative ideas for how to best serve them is, yes, I think that I think there's value to that to the degree. I also, though, think we need to be wary of putting all the burden, either intellectual or emotional, on students to solve the problem. It's our job to make the educational environment accessible to them, and so we shouldn't, while we should include them, ask them, we shouldn't look to them exclusively. Another point I want to make related to this is, and this, people can disagree about this, but the law, does put an onus on students to formally request disability accommodations, and part of that is for the student's own protection, right, and to help them, demonstrate as a matter of law that they sought the accommodation, it was denied, because denial of an accommodation is a violation. But there are huge, as Matt suggested, there are huge institutional, emotional, and social capital barriers to navigating the disability accommodation request process that are very onerous. And so, my view is that, professors, yes, the Disability Services Office exists to funnel these requests, to evaluate them, and and also to protect student privacy, so that perhaps the student, I'm sure many of you received accommodation requests from Disability Services or the registrar that doesn't identify the student, which is great. It's protecting their privacy. But if a student does feel comfortable, comes up to you directly and tells you their need, and they haven't gone through the hoops, and it's the first day of class, my suggestion is that your instinct should be to accommodate, refer them to Disability Services, yes, but perhaps accommodate without that. And of course, as many people have also already emphasized, another animating value is to ask questions, including of our disability services. So in teaching students, both with disabilities and without, I think, and as the title of my sort of presentation suggests, teaching universally and teaching flexibly, effective pedagogy in this area, I think, involves at least two components. One is the idea of a universal design or access. So, which means that the goal is to create a baseline approach for teaching or learning that is accessible and empowering to as many people as possible, regardless of their ability and specific learning preferences. And so the more universal educational systems are, the less need we have to provide specific accommodations, and hopefully you're lessening those burdens I was just referring to on each individual student to come forward. And this principle also, has roots in the quote unquote social model of disability, which is that, which posits that yes, some disabilities may have roots in medical diagnoses, but the world, the social model of disability is that the way the world is structured, which creates, that empowers people either to be abled or disabled, right? Like, it's not a person's mobility that is the issue. It's whether or not the sidewalks are built universally to have ramps or not. And so the society helps determine whether somebody is impaired or not. And so the theory behind universal design is that we want to create society environments that lower the social burdens as much as possible. But universal accessibility is not, it's a goal. In practice, it's probably not achievable, right? Like we are wonderfully diverse, and that's great. And so to the extent that our universal designs are not doing the job, we also need to supplement those with bespoke tailored responses to each individual's unique and varied learning. So those two principles, I think, should guide how we think about our classrooms, right? Like, try to make them universally accessible, but to the extent that they're not, be prepared and enthused about making bespoke accommodations. And so now I'm going to get a little more specific, focusing on law school learning and some things that I've come to believe in as I've grown as a teacher. And again, I am indebted to many of my students for a lot of these suggestions. And again, without putting the burden on them, I have been enlightened by them and really appreciate the conversations I've had with several students about these topics. Many people, regardless if they can meet the sometimes onerous definition of disability, learn in different ways and benefit from lots of different kinds of educational approaches. Some of those approaches, just for starters, are oral learning, that is listening, reading, visual learners, and experiential learning, of course, which the law school is getting, and law schools are getting better at. But I would say the law school's traditional baseline approach is reading and oral. Here's your con law book. It's 1,600 pages. Go read it. Here's a lecture. Listen to it. Right? Like that's sort of the go-to, and there's a lot of value in that. And to be clear, I assign a shit ton of reading, and I do a lot of talking. So it's not to say that these are bad, not at all. But they perhaps are not the end all, be all, and we should think of creatively about supplementing them. And so here are some things that I've increasingly tried to do to supplementing, the close reading and the oral experience that is law school. One is slides, both while I'm talking and as a source of review. I think, slides are important because some people are visual learners and like to read and don't respond orally. I think having readable text, I'm imperfect at this and inconsistent. Sometimes I'm good at it, sometimes I'm not. I think having images or videos with captioning is also important. I think that, using wordplay to help, and images that conjure associations for students can be helpful. An obvious example I've done here is, okay, I'm talking about the importance of slides. I pictured a giant slide here, not the kind of slide I'm thinking about, but that may help some people to jog their memories. And I think you can do this with cases too. If there's a key takeaway, try to think of images that kind of encapsulate that key point or the memorable characters in the case. Get people involved, and this relates to experiential learning. I use the Socratic method in a relatively soft way, and I believe that it has its place because I believe that answering questions is good practice, and that's a good learning technique too that people need to foment as they make the transition to becoming a successful attorney. But I think that there are other ways to get people involved as well, including small group conversations, friendly debates, and practice problems. I try to do practice problems at the end of every unit to really engage the students in having them walk through a legal problem. And this is in doctrinal podium classes. We sit and we talk and we go through problems. The students do it in advance, and then we do it together. One note I also want to make about slides, and I know we're focused on disability, but in crafting slideshows and images in particular, I think it's important to sometimes explain references and be aware that people from diverse backgrounds, we're not all going to know the same references, and make sure that people you're putting on your slides are themselves diverse in terms of ability, sexuality, race. Don't keep putting up, able-bodied white men, and be aware of your own cultural preferences. So, one example in the next slide is, for example, this is Professor Kingsfield from the paper chase, which some of you may be familiar with, right? But paper chase may not be familiar to all students. And so I use this slide on the first day of my classes to emphasize that I try not to be a scary a teacher, and to alleviate anxiety, because anxiety is a barrier to all students learning, including students who have anxiety as a source of, as a result of a disability, okay? But not everybody knows who Professor Kingsfield is, right? So like when I'm teaching this class, I show a short video of Professor Kingsfield, explain it, and so that people are in on the joke, right? And that it's not just going to people who come from a family of lawyers and may be familiar from this outset. I do believe that. And I think there's a societal discussion about there was an op-ed in the Times today from a frequent New York Times editorial that I think was like, the time of coddling is over, or something like that. I think that there's this ongoing discussion about, are we as educators spoon feeding or coddling, and I would urge folks to sort of question that. If you feel like you're over coddling or whatever, really question that, because I think that it is a false dichotomy to suggest that students are not motivated and not interested in working hard, while at the same time interested in not being unnecessarily stressed out and made anxious. I think that our students, all of our students, work really hard and are extremely motivated, and that focusing on ways to make the learning experience as least stressful and most accommodating as possible is not a form of coddling that is making them unprepared for the workforce, but is indeed hopefully creating, engendering a culture within future generations of lawyer that takes into account the fact that we can get things done, work hard, and be productive without the unnecessary stress that Scott alluded to in his opening remarks. And so I think creating an atmosphere of trust from the outset can help do that for students with disability and those without. There's also, some literature in the universal design pedagogy materials that talk about how it's really beneficial to students learning to explain your pedagogical approach, explain why you're doing what you're doing, and explain your goals for what you're doing. And this isn't to suggest that my pedagogical approach is correct, but as an example of that, my classes and related to this, students like structure and they like routine, and that can be really helpful for many students. So I tell my students on day one that our class period is going to involve two things basically every day. The first part of the class will be review of the prior class, and this is me mostly talking for just about 10 minutes. I just go over and really synthesize the prior day's material, including with review slides, which I then circulate to the students so that they can incorporate into their outlines. And then we go on to analyze the new material. So each class involves two things. One, building muscle memory, deploying analytical skills and tools that they need to be a successful lawyer. And so building those independently themselves first through our classroom discussions, and then not hiding the ball at the beginning of the next class after they've done the work, okay? breaking it down for them, synthesizing it for them, because I do think there's a frustration and some students, despite our best efforts to make the Socratic process engaging, it's not universally accessible. And so doing some kind of review, breaking it down, can enhance the degree to which it is accessible. I don't actually think that's spoon feeding. I think it's effective and clear instruction that both requires developing analytical skills by also helping them get the key takeaways from the Black Letter Law. I think that one key teaching way to make sure our classrooms are accessible to all students, including students with disabilities, is to ask them what we can do. And so one thing I've tried to do is to ask students, relatively early on, about third way through the semester, what is working and what is not working. And this is anonymous, obviously. I ask them to just fill out a very short 3-question form. What are teaching techniques that you find really helpful in our class? What are teaching techniques that you would modify, or suggestions, improvements? I've gotten a ton of great ideas from doing this. And then the third question is, what area of laws do you want more review on? And I think that early feedback, we do the FCQs at the end, which is helpful for any future classes, but not so helpful for the current students. And so trying to course correct midstream, I think, can be of value. So one of the final things I'll discuss before getting suggestions from you, and again, all of this is just my experience and my advice. None of it is gospel by any means, and I look forward to pushback on all of it. One big topic is whether or not technology is friend or foe in the law school class, and the answer to that is highly varied, and depends on the student, right? For many students, laptops are an indispensable learning tool. For students that have attention deficit limitations or impulse control issues, laptops can be their worst enemy, right? A huge distraction. And not just the laptops that they're using, but the laptops being used around them. And so, and again, I didn't start with this approach. I started as a laptop no person unless you got an accommodation. And I've moved against that because one, I think many students need laptops and benefit from them, and because it can be stigmatizing and outing to people's privacy. And so I talk very candidly with my students about these pros and cons and encourage them to be respectful of others. One thing I am considering without trying to balkanize the classroom in any way, or label it ableist or disableist, because I think people fall into both categories, is just encouraging people, if they don't want to use laptops, to sit in one area, and if they do want to use laptops, to sit in another. I'm interested in feedback on that. Whether that people see that as problematic, so long as it's framed not as about ability or disability, but just about learning styles and what you learn best from, because I do know that students get distracted by other people's laptops. Another technology that can be empowering but also has risk is recording. Recording classes, a lot of students will get accommodations for recordings. And again, a universal access issue that can be deployed with relatively low cost in terms of your time is audibly record the classrooms. And that's a helpful accommodation for people who benefit from repetition, people who have problems focusing during class, and people who may need a flexible attendance accommodation. That said, there are, of course, privacy concerns with recording. And I think it's well worth considering whether or not you should maybe not record when the class is about a particular sensitive topic, and when you're trying to elicit vulnerable responses from students that may invoke their own personal experiences. Interactive ongoing assessments are a great way to not only serve student needs and check in with them, but also can be effectively done through technology. I myself haven't done this, but I know several of our colleagues involved use polls. I've seen Professor Bauer really effectively deploy Socratica in her classroom to get live responses from her class about particular questions she's asking. I know Professor Ben Halim uses similar tactics to great effect, and I don't want to put them on the spot, but I'm sure, and Professor Speck as well, I think does a lot of polling, but I'm sure they could talk to people about those technologies. Another, this is a technology in the sense, you know, can be pretty low tech. It can involve a laptop, but you know, one other thing that I know some people do and find effective is, you know, because there can be issues with distraction in class and lack and inability to focus, you know, having a rotating, maybe not universal, but having some people who will rotate taking notes and then having those notes distributed to the group, I think can be an effective tool. Sometimes that is, again, granted as a specific accommodation request, but there's really no reason why that can't be a universal approach. And I think it also, to the extent that it has students sharing, can help have some positive benefits in terms of the culture of the law school classroom and make it more collaborative rather than competitive. And again, in terms of cultural competency and explaining images, that's a young Steve Jobs looking, I don't know, friendly or sinister. I'll leave it to you to decide. You know, I think, again, I think, you know, just coming back to an opening point, this is the band Fun that some of you may or may not be familiar with, but again, there can be this can be scary, right? It can be nerve-wracking, but I think it's actually an opportunity for creativity, fun, and getting to know better, awesome, resilient, and brilliant students. So that's my last bit of advice, and really eager to hear other people's insights and questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Skinner-Thompson. At this point, we're going to open things up for questions. People just use the raise hand button if you have a question, and yeah, we'll do it like that. Go ahead, Professor Reed.
Hey, this is Blake. Can you hear me okay, Scott?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Excellent. Really appreciate you pulling this presentation together and just a ton of useful information. Just wanted to underscore, and I think there are a bunch of folks from main campus here on this call that are in a good position to answer questions. But accessibility is also a big priority for the campus and has become increasingly so in the course of the pandemic as we shift to online learning. And in the chat, if you haven't looked at it, there's a whole bunch of useful links that are circulating in terms of guidance for how to approach online distance learning in an accessible way, access to resources, for example, for getting closed captioning done on videos you're using in class, and that sort of thing. Just also wanted to flag, I serve on the campus has an information technology accessibility review board, and it's a consortium of faculty members and others that evaluate the campus's standards for accessibility, and we tend to see issues coming down the pike. So we're thinking about things like how to make sure textbooks are accessible in the fall, if we have to do hybrid or more online sort of coursework, that sort of thing. So just wanted to throw out, I'm super happy to serve as a resource if folks are struggling with digital accessibility and need to reach out to someone on main campus. this are just looking for a place to start. And just appreciate you pulling this together, Scott. I think it's a super important thing that we be thinking about in our teaching, and just hope we can continue to iterate and improve on the things that we're doing in class, to make sure that our offerings are effective and accessible to everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Could I just ask you a quick question related to that, either to Blake or to Laura, who I see on the chat? Are there technologies that are being made available with regard to captioning Zoom classes in real time, or what are potential resources for that?
Yeah, I can jump in and talk about that for a second.
Great. Thank you.
It's a great question. In terms of Zoom integrated captioning options, there are kind of two broad ways to think about it. So the first one would be manual live captions, which is you actually have a transcriptionist who's sitting, in their house, wherever they are, on the Zoom call, providing transcription as it goes. So that's really high quality. And currently that's only available if there's a student who has a live captioning accommodation within a course. Then DS will pay for that. Disability Services would pay for that. It can also be arranged proactively, but then the department would be paying for that. In terms of the other option, which would be like AI-driven automated captions, which are lower quality, we're exploring some options around that at the moment. We don't currently have a great solution to point to yet, but there's 2 or 3 different technology vendors that we're looking at to try to find a good AI-driven Zoom integration tool, just to kind of have a range of options available for people with a variety of sort of budgetary constraints to be able to have something rather than nothing.
Thank you.
This is Blake. I just tag on real quickly, and this is maybe more applicable for meetings that folks are hosting, or structured discussions, than it is for class. But there's a lot of protocols to follow if you've got folks that are communicating using CART, using live captioning, or who are signing, that are relate mainly to how you manage a queue and how you manage who's going to speak when. I'll drop into the chat in just a second. I got to dig up the link. The folks at Gallaudet University have pulled together a really comprehensive guide for how to manage meetings like that. That's a good way to think about how you're structuring things if you've got folks that are signing or using CART on a call. So I'll send that around.
Perfect. And it looks like Suzette has a question.
Okay, there you go. Hi, thank you. This has just been such an excellent presentation. So thanks to everybody who has organized this and spoken today. I appreciate all these good ideas, because it sort of reminds me not to get so stale as a professor in terms of some of the strategies that I use in teaching. I did want to, I guess, add something to what Professor Skinner-Thompson said, to Scott's point that he made, and maybe add a caveat of my own, in that if you are a professor and you're trying to figure out what's an appropriate accommodation, you have a student that does come to you that first day of class and hasn't gone through the the formal channels. One of the things, I guess I would add a caution to that, right? In terms of us sort of directly engaging at that moment, in terms of what we think might work or not work, just because you want to, I think, have a spirit of openness and helpfulness, but at the same time, many of us are not experts in this, and it's a dicey endeavor to jump into. And it might be true, Scott, you and I are experts, right? To some degree, we might feel we're experts, but we can be our worst enemies at times. And so I would, suggest, as I think you did, Scott, to say, first things first, go to disability services and work directly with people who do this all the time, so that we don't do more harm than good. So even though we come from a spirit of generosity and openness, I think sometimes faculty can get themselves sort of bogged down and mired with some pretty complicated issues, and those channels are there for the protection of the student, of the faculty member, of the institution, sort of all players. So I just, I kind of throw that out there as a reminder, as helpful as we want to be careful that we are not working against ourselves and against that structure.
Thank you. I see that Matt has his hand raised now.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime back in for a moment, and just from the student's perspective, and hearing many of the strategies that Professor Skinner-Thompson discussed, that from a student's perspective, some of those, both from like just pedagogical and also as a student with disabilities, some of those strategies were incredibly helpful for me in law school. Not only taking Professor Skinner-Thompson's classes, but also in some other professors' classes that were using some of these things. For example, the recapping was really helpful, and giving more than one opportunity to get critical information can be really, I think, not only helpful for a student like me, but probably anybody who struggles with focus, and as well, just sometimes being transparent with the class about what your pedagogical goals are and the strategies. Certainly as a student who is trying to think about what I need in terms of accommodation and how to equally access a class, it helped me understand where a professor was coming from, and to try to build off of that rather than to work against what some of your goals were. So I just wanted to add that caveat.
Definitely, thank you. And I saw that Alexia had her hand raised a little bit ago.
Yes, I just wanted to mention that in Zoom, if you are recording a course and saving it to the cloud, you can set it so that it auto-transcribes the presentation and will provide a transcript. Granted, it needs to be cleaned up afterwards, but it will provide a transcript to go along with the presentation, and it timestamps it so that you can click on that language and then go to the part of the presentation that you are trying to get information about. So that could be, a helpful path for some students as well.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any comments or questions? It seems not. Okay, well, we can go ahead and end things here. I've recorded this, and I'll make sure that it's available for anybody who wants to see it. I just wanted to thank my panelists once again, Professor Skinner-Thompson, Alison, Matt. You were great. I really appreciate you guys setting aside time to come here and talk about something so important. I also want to thank Dean Anaya, Dean Guzman, for all of their help setting all this up. Alexia has been an amazing source of guidance through this entire project. And yeah, if anyone has any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me at my CU email address, scott.goodstein@colorado.edu. Also, because Valerie Hamilton-Brodie wasn't able to be here, I'll go ahead and include her PowerPoints with the presentation when I send out the recording. So that way you guys have access to some of the links that were in her presentation. All right, well, thank you everyone for
Scott, thank you for doing this. I don't think you know how difficult it is to get a group of faculty together. So, it's like you did a great job herding the cats, and I think you should feel really great about this.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Scott. Have a good
Thank
weekend,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.